So it is more of, I understand that it's more of a reflection on them than us. It does seem like there's a lot more of it. And I'm just really curious about what is causing it and what is creating it. And I don't feel like it's all that. I think in some ways there's probably a lot we can learn from it. For me, I have this belief that if there is something wrong in the world, that it's an our thing. Yes, I think there's individual aspects of it, but I think it's more of a manifestation of like our society or people as a whole. We can look over time and we can see trends, and like, like serial killers was a big thing like in the 70s, I think, and like the way that those things were happening in that time, that people could kill multiple people over a period of time or a short period of time and not get caught for it, or those sorts of things. There was an environment and a situation in which those things could happen, that are no longer existent today, say like in the US. And I'm just kind of speaking from a very limited perspective and my understanding of the US. I don't know why I picked up serial killers, but as kind of the example, but that's what kind of like makes sense to me. And like, yes, and even in that, in and of that self, I think a serial killer is, obviously there's some wrong, and people, you want to label them a monster and those sorts of things, and there's obviously something unwell in that individual. But in my understanding, and not everyone who has similar experiences becomes dot 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 or does this with that circumstance, but I don't think those people are created in a vacuum. I think that there are a lot of environmental, a lot of social, probably physical, biological things that kind of play into that. And so seeing that that was something that was happening in that time was more of kind of, I think, a manifestation of maybe a failing within people as a whole. Just like nowadays you have more of the kind of the mass shooting kind of phenomenon where people just go in and kill a big bunch of people. I think the fact that they are predominantly masculine or white men, is probably, again, something to look at. Serial killers in a lot of ways was kind of more commonly, again, kind of white men as well. Anyway, I just think that there's probably something as a society that we could be looking at what is creating that within our people. And I think if we look at our politics, our politics are much like the comment sections of our social media. There is so many, I think, intersections, and I just think that there's something amiss in the world, and it's creating all of these, manifestations of things. I think, the AIDS epidemic and how it was able to come into a certain community and impact a certain community more so than any other community, that was a product of the way society looked at a group of people and valued a group of people. And so that makes that group of people more vulnerable. And if the right circumstances come into play, then that can, I guess, reproduce or transmit, and really kind of cause a havoc, because again, it's kind of like dealing with people who are thought to be less than. And I think that's something that we're seeing happen a lot with trans people in this particular time, is kind of being and this is my perspective. Like I'm a trans person, so maybe that's why I am seeing it or feeling it that way. I'm also a person who is living with HIV. My experience with HIV in the 90s when I got infected, or even if I look at the 70s and 80s, the experience that people were having with HIV was vastly different. And a lot of that difference is how society and how communities and how groups of people were responding and engaging and contributing to that situation that was impacting a group of people. And I think I think there's kind of a similar thing around, say, transness, or there's other things where if there is an over and over failing to a group of people, or that it's a bigger picture thing, and it's something that our society is failing. And I think ultimately it comes down to this idea of somehow seeing people as less than. And I think what happens a lot is I've been in conversations with a lot of folks, because I tend to try to be somebody who tries to talk with people who are very different than myself. Me and my aunt, we have a podcast, and um, there, I think the truth, and we hear this often. So if I'm thinking about the folks who are usually saying things about me, or who they represent or whatever, oftentimes I have people who are Christian, who are um, uh, who think that being LGBTQ is wrong or whatever, right? And or like you kind of have like there's a big kind of talk about how trans people are taking womanhood away from women, or there's kind of a lot of that language. But I think there's this feeling of a lot of people feeling like somebody else's um, expression, or what somebody else gets to do somehow takes away from your own. Like I hear it a lot where Christians feel oppressed. Some Christians talk about how they're feeling oppressed right now and everyone's against them. And some women who are feeling oppressed by the trans community because we're taking over womanhood, or we're taking up space that women could be in, or, and all of this sort of stuff. I'm just find curious. I don't think that people are just making up shit that's not what they're experiencing and what is not their perception of their reality. So do we just say, girl, you have nothing to worry about, or girl, just get over it, or that's not real, or whatever, which I think is a lot of what some of us do. And I think part of that, I know for me, is because it's personal. One thing that I can share is that this might be into is, most of you know that I've transitioned more recently in the last couple of years. Next Sunday when I'm on, it'll be my 2-year anniversary since starting hormones. But I started using she pronouns before transitioning or identifying as trans. Probably about, I was living in Chicago at the time, so this was probably around a decade ago. And I remember I was really starting to feel like I really loved the pronoun she. For whatever reason. And I had a time in my life where you called me she, and I was like, no, I was not okay with it. And then I got to a point in my life when I think I got a little bit, I was sober. I was in more of a spiritual way of life, and just I think had a better perception of life and things. And I was more able to accept and hold more of myself without fear of other people. But in that, people would call me she, and I just loved it. I felt seen. I even would say that people who call me she, it's because they see my spirit. I felt like my spirit was feminine on the inside. And so people who were very close to me in my life would call me girl, or she. And I can't tell you what it did to me. It touched my spirit. It touched into me and affirmed a place in me that, that just felt good. I can't really explain it, but I remember feeling that she-ness was something that like I kind of had to keep to myself when I thought about becoming more officially using she pronouns, say like at work. I remember thinking like, well, to be she means all these sorts of things to be like a woman. Either I was born and identified as a woman, or for myself as somebody who was assigned male at birth, and this was fairly known, and I was then wanting to go by she, that there was some sort of like I was a trans person, and I was going from like a male to womanhood, and there was only one way to be a woman or whatever. And I actually had people tell me this as well. I remember applying for a job, and I remember having applied for a job, and then them asking me too, like, are these really your pronouns? Because we don't. So I think there was like this and basically I'm just kind of telling you like what the back and forth of my experience with that was, because so, and there's someone in the comments saying, do you feel I think it's non-binary, and sorry, does non-binary people also be considered trans? And some